Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the special meeting. We're here to talk about flooding in the Winooski River watershed. An issue that has been pretty traumatic the last few years. Just some ground rules. Please raise your hand and ask to be recognized to speak. When you do speak, please go up to the podium and use the microphone so all the virtual world can hear us. As usual, Richmond always does a good job with this, but just a friendly reminder to be courteous, be polite. At this point, I'll turn it over to Josh, who will do introductions.
Thank you, David. This evening, we have three engineers from Stone Environmental joining us, Meghan Arpino, Ben Matthews, and Branden Martin. They're going to be doing most of the talking or most of the setup of the meeting this evening. And they're here to, like David said, start the Winooski River. This is our kickoff meeting. And I'll probably just turn it over to Meghan, as I think she knows more than I do, and we'll let her start the meeting off.
Sounds great. Thank you. And thanks all for having us here. We're looking forward to starting to work on this project for Richmond. My name is Meghan. I'm a hydrologist and certified floodplain manager with Stone Environmental, and I'm serving as the primary point of contact and manager from the Stone end of things for this project. And then I'll let Ben and Branden.
So I'm Ben Matthews. I'm a river scientist with Stone, and I'm going to be helping out with some of the hydraulic analysis and looking at some of the options for solutions with the hazard mitigation program through FEMA.
I'm Branden Martin, water resource engineer, Stone Environmental, and I'll be assisting with multiple facets of the project and probably taking the reins, mostly on the conceptual design phase.
Yeah. And our overall goal for the meeting today is really to go over the scope of this project, the overall timeline, and then to get input from all of you on specific areas of concern around flooding or project ideas that have been floating around in your head, just for us to get some input in general as we start on the hydraulic study portion of the project.
Anybody have any questions before we jump in?
Yes.
Please come up to the microphone.
If you could just speak up a little louder, that would be great, I think, for all of us.
Oh, thanks. We
Sure.
can do that.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So just briefly, what we're going to go through, we're going to do just what I said, overview of the project scope and timeline, and then we're going to look at some examples of flood mitigation projects. Part of this project is specifically developing projects for hazard mitigation grant program funding. And there's a certain types of projects that are eligible for that type of funding. So I'll give a little bit of an overview of those project types as well. And then we'll turn it over to the more input session portion of the meeting to hear from you. So the overall goal of this project is to complete a flood mitigation scoping study to assess current flood risks in Richmond, evaluate mitigation options for reducing flood levels, future events. And there's a few objectives that we're going to be working on to reach that overall goal. So the first is a hydraulic study focusing on the main stem of the Winooski River through Richmond. So for this part, we'll be developing a hydraulic model that's going to look at river flows using existing data sources, as well as topographic and bathymetric data that we are partnering with a geospatial firm called Whiteout Solutions to collect via drone. So they're going to be collecting high resolution LiDAR data of the river itself to help develop this hydraulic model. And then Stone staff may do some additional site visits and surveying as needed to support the model development. We're going to be using, getting into the weeds a bit, but we'll be using the U.S. Army Corps Hydraulic Engineering Center's river analysis system. So HECRAS is kind of the term for that, and it's a widely accepted model for this type of work. And in addition to simulating current flooding conditions, we'll also be looking at the potential benefits of the projects that we are assessing throughout this scope of work. We'll be doing a kind of comparable hydraulic study on some key tributaries to the Winooski River. So similarly, we'll be developing hydraulic models likely along the Jones Mill Brook, Snipe Island, and possibly looking at the confluence of the Huntington River. The exact extent of the tributary models is still kind of to be determined, but there will be the hydraulic study along the key tributaries as well, also using the HECRES model. For those studies, we'll end up with a hydraulic study report that's going to summarize like the model development, the methods used, the data, and also how we can use that model to help identify and assess potential flood mitigation projects to reach that goal of reducing flood levels where we can. The third objective that's part of the project is completing an alternatives analysis to identify cost-effective flood mitigation projects, specifically that are eligible for the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funding. So we'll be using the hydraulic models that we develop in those first two objectives, review of existing data from Richmond and plans. There's a lot of work that has already happened that we'll be looking at, and the input we received today to help inform what projects we want to include in the alternatives analysis. That process will likely involve creating a matrix where we're evaluating the projects on some key criteria, which will likely include eligibility for funding, feasibility, how likely is it that we can actually construct this project, permitting ease and constraints, the potential magnitude of the flood mitigation benefit, community alignment. So is this a project that fits with the type of project Richmond would like to see, and cost effectiveness. And we'll get into the types of projects that we can consider, but during that process, we could consider projects on public land, private land with landowner permission. And we have a wide range of solutions we can consider, from like targeted site-specific things like a culvert upgrade and upsizing to a more holistic approach, maybe combining multiple parcels for a floodplain reconnection effort. So there's kind of a wide range of things that can be considered at that stage. Once we've gone through the alternatives analysis, we'll work in coordination with the town to identify one or more projects to move to a design phase under the scope of this project. Still have that list of potential projects available for reference, but within the scope of this project, we have to pick one, maybe a few more projects that fit within the scope and budget to develop conceptual designs for. We'll also go through the benefit cost analysis process. This is required for FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funding. We have to show that the benefits of the project outweigh the costs. So that will be part of this step as well. And providing support for developing application materials for the selected project alternative. And the last thing is going to be presenting everything from those previous steps in a final report, kind of outlining all of the analysis done, project vetting through alternatives and the conceptual designs. Okay. And this is an overview of the timeline that we've included for the project. I did adjust the beginning a little bit since we're now having the kickoff meeting in December, so I pushed that one up a bit. But overall, we're hoping to complete the project in June of next year. starting with this existing data review and the hydraulic studies, and there's some overlap in the phases, so we'll be able to work on some things at the same time. And then this is kind of where we are right now. So we have currently started our existing data review of plans that Richmond has and previous work like your hazard mitigation plan. And we're prepping for field data collection, specifically with Whiteout Solutions, who will be collecting our LiDAR data. They're hoping to get out in the next week or so, but there are limitations around when they can get out with weather. So it can't be too cold for them to fly, and we don't want to have too much snow on the ground. So we're kind of balancing finding a good window for them to get out there. I wonder if, so that's kind of the project overview, and then I was going to move into the example projects. I don't know if it's a good time to open up for project scope questions. Okay.
Sure, if you want to do that, maybe keep it limited to that because you'll look at other projects.
Yeah.
There'll be other things down the line.
Yeah.
Maybe if there's questions on the scope of the project at this time. I think your next thing you're going to talk about is potential outcomes, potential projects that could come out of this. But if there's anything so far you have questions on, that would be a good time. You can come up to the microphone too, just so we can hear you. Thank you.
Here, I live in Huntington, but I'm curious, you mentioned the type of data that you're going to be gathering. I haven't heard anything about taking a look at any of the history of the river and of flooding within the town and how the river channel perhaps has changed over the last 30 or 40 years. Is that anything that you will be able to research, or is it just present day moving forward using the LiDAR data and other information that you're going to be gathering basically in the field?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So a lot of this study will be looking at existing conditions and looking forward, but especially as we get into the project vetting stage, something we often do as part of the design process is look at historical imagery. UVM has is a great resource for like historic aerial imagery, like earlier in the 20th century data sets. And so we do look at historic data to kind of inform, the general river patterns and migration over time. This in part of the design.
And there are like Google Maps goes back to the
Yeah.
year 2000. You can, if you're ever really bored, get on Google Maps and there's a place to click where you can say, go back in time. And you can actually take a place and just start clicking and go back. How did it look last year? How did it look the year before that? There's a lot of that video data, that visual data out there. And they were also asking earlier, do we have maps? Does the Historical Society have maps? And I started to say, well, let me tell you something, because we have a lot of them. There's a lot of stuff to wade through. And I think that is relevant. I'm not a hydrological engineer, but anything we can put together that would help, we're going to do.
And it's kind of related. So I want to add it. We do, as part of the benefit cost analyses and earlier on in the alternatives analysis, we'll look at this, and in the existing data review, we'll look at this. We look at areas that have had repeated damages due to flooding. So that's something else that we look at, not necessarily the river migration itself, but that history of repeated flooding to understand the areas that are getting, hit more frequently than others.
Like good.
Absolutely.
Some of that will also include cost incurred with those historical flooding occurrences and what it costs to repair that damage, because that data helps fuel the BCA. Like how much money has a town or a private landowner spent here, and if we mitigate this risk, how much money could that potentially save in the future?
Marcy Harding, and those were all questions that I wondered about. And in terms of the cost benefit analysis and the costs that we've incurred in the past, I'm curious to know from the select board or from Josh, do we have pretty good data right now, records, especially from the road crew, on what they've spent on our roads?
Yeah, certainly from the last two floods, we have very good records of that.
And December, we can't forget about December last year. So there's really 3 events.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay, good.
Pete does keep really good records. Absolutely. Yeah.
Our highway foreman is nothing if not painstaking. So I hope that we will have more than just the last couple of years.
We do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Lieutenant, I'm actually a hydrologist, so came here because I live in Richmond and hopefully I have useful contributions. I was curious about the spatial scope of the study. Just because it seems to talk a lot about inundation, particularly with use of HEC-RAS models and as they were just talking about Pete's data could confirm, but it seemed like a lot of our damage in Richmond from the past few events have been erosive hazards, not necessarily the inundation itself. So waterways that are empty ditches most of the year that become raging torrents during these events. That seemed to be, at least to my perspective, probably the major costs for the town of Richmond in these past events. So I'm curious if this study is going to incorporate that or it's merely looking at inundation for the mapped waterways.
Yeah, that's a great question. We are primarily focusing along the main stem and the tributaries, but we will be looking at both inundation and erosion, but major goal is like ways that we can reduce the inundation.
And then White, are they collecting LiDAR data or photogrammetry? Sorry if I missed that.
LiDAR, so it's a green LiDAR, so it can penetrate the water surface and get both the bathymetry and the riverbank area.
Well, yeah, if they share those data with the town, you might be able to infer where the old stream channels were if the LiDAR is high enough resolution.
There's a couple of links in the chat for some historic data, which you guys might already know about, but if not, the chat will be included in the minutes. So if you need to find those links, they'll be there.
Yes.
One of the reasons I asked about the historic aspect of your study is I've recently learned that Overrocker Park is named Overrocker because of a company that used that as a base of operations to remove gravel from the river. And 40 some years ago, state statutes stopped that practice. And I'm curious if the river filling more and more and more with each of these events is causing more and more inundation here in the village because the removal of the gravel is no longer occurring. Now, I've lived in Huntington for just shy of 50 years, and I've gone across the bridge on the Huntington-Richmond Road frequently. And in the last 10 or a dozen years, when you look upstream and downstream, you see large gravel islands that never used to be there. And just from a lay perspective, it seems to me that that is impeding flow of water. And if the water is not being able to move through town as readily, then it's going to rise and go into floodplain areas. And that's a good thing, except we don't want volunteers green and the main road to be one of those floodplain areas. So I'm curious on that historic perspective, if there's any correlation between the ending of gravel removal in strategic locations with the larger flood events that we're seeing, you know, taking into account, of course, greater rain. But is that something that will be part of your research?
Looking at that change in the timing of that historical event itself, probably most likely not. But understanding inundation with the current bathymetry of the river will be. And I think that gets to your question.
With the river channel filling with gravel that has come from erosion, does that cause more of a flood effect?
So I can jump in.
Yeah, sure.
So I think we're pretty focused on what the current situation is and what are the, solutions and mitigation actions that are available to us. So that's what the study, we're going to focus on that. The question that you're asking is an interesting and a good one, but would require a lot more analysis on parts of the study that aren't really necessary for us to answer those questions. We're looking at the existing conditions and saying what could happen. So one of the things that we can look at potentially is what the impacts of gravel removal would be now. But looking at it from the past isn't necessarily gonna help that, because we're in the situation that we're at right now. And that's kind of a bigger study that would require more money and kind of more of an academic study than necessarily an engineering study like we're proposing here.
Hey, sorry, I'm not there. Bard Hill, a member of the select board. My observation is that while we're not unique in topography, we're somewhat unusual, at least by Chittenden County standards, in terms of our topography, because, and I'm wrestling with the right words to use, the secondary basins or watersheds that come off really tall mountains, not far from the river, that come down. And so what I've seen in the last 5 years that basically didn't see before that are the intense localized rainstorms that blow out culverts. They come into the secondary, pretty good sized watersheds or secondary basins, get funneled down and blow through everything. So I guess my first question is, do you have a sense of the financial impact of those secondary watershed erosions versus inundation? Because it's my subjective impression that the cost of those erosive events, coming down off the mountainsides is really significant. And when you get to cost benefit or return on investment, is that something you consider? What has been the financial impact of those events? Separate from the inundation from the primary tributary or river itself?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that yet. But we will be modeling like more frequently occurring floods. So we often talk about the 100-year flood or 1% current interval or flood, and that is very informative for these large magnitude events. But we'll also be modeling some of the more frequently occurring storms, like a 10-year, 20, and so on. And when you do see damages at those more frequently occurring events, you can absolutely include that in your cost benefit analysis. So we will be thinking about that. And you bring up a great point with the steepness in your tributaries, and that's something we see in other areas in Vermont, is these steep tributaries coming into our river valleys, and then you have some development at the confluence of these two systems, and you can also see issues there. So we haven't begun any of our analysis, but we will be looking at more frequently occurring events as well.
I will say a lot of that, the question that you asked, a lot of the information on the economics is probably captured in those damage numbers from the roads, because most of that damage is usually around the erosion of the road. That's not all of it for sure, but there, you can get a pretty good handle on what that number is by looking at what culverts blew out and how much you had to pay for your road repair.
There is one area in which erosive action is particularly important. We have a place along Cochrane Road on the south bank of the river, Warren Ruth Beacon River Shore Preserve. And we've been watching, I was just clicking through the historical imagery, and the river has been creeping closer and closer to where it will actually wash out Cochrane Road in a few years. Last time we discussed it, we kind of had the sense of, well, the river is going to go where the river wants to go, but that would be a major nuisance if it just cuts out a major artery through that part of town.
That's a really good transition into talking about areas of concerns and projects.
Yay.
Yeah. So I'm gonna jump into giving an overview of very high level the hazard mitigation grant program funding and what are considered eligible project types. So the FEMA HMGP funding is available to towns and other eligible applicants for projects that reduce the risk of flooding or other hazards. Within the context of reducing flood hazards, the eligible project types that we have are natural resource projects such as floodplain restoration or reconnection, where you're restoring natural floodplain processes. Or we often see dam removal in this category. That's not removal of a functioning flood control dam, but removal of historic ones that are no longer serving their purpose. Maybe they are listed as a high hazard dam, sediments accumulating behind them, and therefore we're getting increased flooding upstream. So I just want to make that differentiation. It's not talking about, the ones that are serving their purpose as flood control dams. Also infrastructure projects like upsizing our bridges and culverts, floodproofing of municipal and commercial buildings, structural projects such as elevating, and then road relocation, elevation, or stabilization work. Buyouts are also eligible for HMGP funding. And then something to keep in mind is that these projects can pursue funding, as unique projects, or you can combine different types of projects in one application. So that's something we'll keep in mind throughout the project would it be beneficial to combine more than one type of project to come up with a more beneficial project that's maybe also more cost effective? For this funding mechanism, I mentioned this earlier, but projects must go through a benefit cost analysis. So the overall benefits of the project need to outweigh the cost of the project implementation. And there's a lot of things that can be considered a benefit. The most direct one is that reduction in damages costs, but there's also benefits associated with projects that have a natural resource restoration element to them. And then I have some photos just of some example projects. And this is, just a subset of what we can do. I don't know if you want to talk, Brandon's going to talk to culvert and bridges.
Sure. So the first one is a culvert project. Obviously, we won't see many or any of those along the main stem. Some of the tributaries or smaller drainages to those tributaries could potentially have this type of project. And that's often the situation where we have an existing culvert that was put in at some point in time, likely undersized. It's potentially created a situation like you see in the top left where that culvert has become perched. So it's holding sediment back, and it's also creating increased erosive flows on the outlet end. So to remediate that situation, we would design a right-sized structure, whether it be a larger box culvert or a bridge, and actually design a natural stream bed through it, reconnect the floodplain in the process, and allow water to move more freely through that location, reducing peak flow and erosive potential.
Great. And then this project example in the middle is from Washington, Vermont. This is a dam removal project. I'm going to see if I can use my laser pointer. Yes. Okay, so this top image, we see the dam where my laser pointer is right now. It was a partially breached and high hazard dam. Just downstream of it, out of view in this picture, unfortunately, is an abandoned home. So this is an example of a project where we combined both a buyout and dam removal, along with channel and floodplain restoration to mitigate flooding, and provide those natural resource restoration benefits. So that bottom photo is flipped around. Up in the top, the water was flowing to the bottom of the PowerPoint, and in the bottom one, it's flowing to the top. But the areas shaded in green are restored floodplain area. The home that was abandoned and downstream is no longer there. And we are seeing flood reductions upstream. We also did a bit outside of the view of this photo. This project involved some smaller tributaries that had unstable banks that were eroding, and this channel was vertically incising. And so we also implemented some stream bank stabilization. Not in here yet are some additional riparian plantings that will be completed next spring. So that's an example of combining different types of projects to see multiple benefits. I also added a photo of just an example of elevating a structure. Overall, if there's ways where we can mitigate the flood inundation levels and reduce those erosive forces before jumping into the structural, that can be more cost effective. So that's kind of an approach we like to take. Sometimes structural approaches are what you have to do, but if there's other projects you can do ahead of time, that's great. And then the bottom right is an example of a bank stabilization project. These can be done using rock, but also with some nature-based solutions such as root wads. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add any.
Sure, yeah, I mean, slope stabilization, some of the projects or some of the locations you talked about, and I'm sure some we'll talk about today, is a huge part of flood mitigation. And typically it's done with big rocks, and that can be useful. But what rock tends to do is it just tends to reflect energy. So if you put rock on one corner, then it will bounce off that rock and then go to across the river and then hit that other corner that may or may not be protected. So if you can use a combination of rock and root wads or plantings, then that can help to, the trees actually will absorb energy and flex with the energy.
Just find your icon for audio and just connect. Yeah, there you go. Just connect. There you go. There you go.
I was feeling like an alien there. It can help, these more nature-based solutions can often help bleed energy out of the river rather than just pushing the problem down or upstream.
Looks like Bart has a question. You guys are for a question?
Well, sorry, it's really just a comment about trees. As somebody who's walked along the Winooski River for about 30 years, if you walk along Volunteer Green, the riverbank there, you will see a number of large trees that have fallen into the river. So I would only point out, it would appear that the ability of even mature trees to control the bank erosion is limited in at least some locations such as that one.
Yeah, that's a great point. These designs, can be site specific. So understanding the options that are kind of like in that, I want to avoid using the classic toolbox phrase, but in the toolbox, and then picking the ones that work best for the location is really important. Okay, so kind of after running through those example projects, the types of projects that are eligible, thinking about, big picture, where are areas where you're seeing repeated inundation or erosion that are really of a concern in Richmond. And then also if you even have ideas for solutions, we want to get input across the board as we get started. So I'll put these kind of framing questions up as we kind of open the floor to input and questions. But yeah, are there areas vulnerable to flooding that you are concerned about? Where have you been seeing repeated damages or repeated issues? And are there certain types of projects that you're really interested in seeing or that you think could help? Think about every location, like there's really no kind of like limit at right now, right? So we're open to hearing all input. And I'm gonna progress the slide online, just forward one more. So you folks who are virtual can see a bit more of a zoomed in map. And then we also, might be a little clunky, but we also have some paper maps for those in the room. when you come up to the mic, feel free to also jot things down on stickies, point things out, and use those maps to help orient yourself. If helpful.
Gave us a couple of links to good historical maps and visuals.
Great, thank you, Stacy. Oh, sorry. I guess I'll stay on the big one for now online, but if folks want, I also have some zoomed in of the tributaries as well, so I can toggle back and forth.
I'm gonna ask a question. If you go back to the one you were just on. The one with that had Snipe Ireland Brook on it. Okay, so if you look at the upper left-hand corner. And this is something that Wright's intimately familiar with. During one of the recent storms, some beaver, correct me if I'm wrong, some beaver dams up there failed.
There are a number of beaver dams in the upper Snipe Island Brook, in Jericho, in Bolton, and in Richmond. Some breached, some did not, some slightly breached. So yes.
So is that something, because there was a lot of inundation coming down Snipe Ireland Brook, is looking at beaver dams or the equivalent thereof something y'all would be looking at?
I think if there's something that like is of a concern, we might look at it, but are there other locations further downstream with beaver dam still intact, or did they all kind of blow out during?
No, in Jericho where.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I got him on this.
You do, okay, you're good. I just want to make sure that you were coming through.
Sure.
Okay.
Excuse me, in Bolton where, northeast of Stage Road, where Preston Pond is, that's the headwaters of Snipe Island Brook. One dam remained in, one dam went out somewhat, and then there's 4 or 5 more dams. Before they all connect east of Richmond. Some stayed in, some went out, some were abandoned previously and had breaches. There were 2 dams below Richmond Pond that were no longer used, and those breached. Richmond Pond has a large dam at the north end of it. There was a small breach in the dam about 8 feet wide, down a foot and a half. So some stayed in, some partially stayed in, and some were washed out.
So I think one thing we probably will not be looking at would be, say, structural integrity of things like beaver dams. But for anything within the limits of what gets flown for LiDAR and becomes part of the hydraulic study, we'll be able to tell from the topography areas that look like they're not a natural stream channel, where there might be an obstruction, and that will probably show up in an inundation model. And what may come out of that would be looking for areas to provide some relief, some flood retention during those higher flows. And if we can do that in locations nearer the headwaters, that should mitigate erosive flows downstream.
Exactly what I was gonna talk about with the meeting. Molly lived in Palm Circle, and I was affected by the Snipe Island Brook flooding. And that's what terrifies me the most is like, you know, looking at tens of thousands of dollars of damage. My neighbor is like 400 buyouts left and right. Like people can't even live in their houses right now. And we're like building back, or should we? What's going on above us? Because it doesn't matter what we do if like nothing happens above us. And it's terrifying. So that's what I wanted to ask about, like beaver baffles. Been working with Bev, a beaver specialist, asking questions to her. She's from Vermont Beaver Association. She's like, I've learned a lot. Yeah, like, is that a thing? Do they work? Like, yeah, and thank you so much for helping us. I feel hopeful for the first time since July 10th, 11th. Thanks.
I can speak to the beaver baffles a little bit, is they can work pretty well around road culverts. They do need maintenance. Typically, it's not something you can put in and walk away from.
Right.
But there is, I think Tyler Brown at the state is somebody who does work with towns to do those things when there's mitigations.
It's funded and maintained by PAC, Protecting the Wildlife.
Oh,
I did not know that.
And she's ready to like help us step in and help out wherever she needs.
Julie on Zoom, go ahead.
Thank you. I just thought it might be a good time to follow up with on Molly's sharing. I live just downstream from Molly I live on Red Barn Lane, and so my house was one of those that was affected the most. So in that area, so my sense of it is that it was a combination of the beaver dam breaches that were just discussed, the culvert that I think perhaps wasn't large enough and got got blocked. And then I think there is also the way in which the stream bends by my downstream of my house also causes, has caused flooding. So I've had repeated flooding. So I would, since you've asked about vulnerable areas, I would definitely put that whole area as quite vulnerable.
Just here, I don't know if you guys know, Red Barn Lane, Lily Pond Circle, they're, you know where they are, right at the bottom of Snipe Island Brook. Okay, just wanted to make sure you were familiar with the area.
It's like this wall of water came down the mountain.
Anybody else? I think Julie, your hand is still up.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Let's hear my video off too.
I'm gonna ask another question. I'm gonna post. Stage Road during the recent flooding. We basically lost Stage Road. It was just a canyon. Again, because of the kind of mountainside sudden intense storm that's just very localized and all that water has to go somewhere. That's another reason. I mean, as people have said, we're all kind of struck dumb by the fact that we have our town park is under 15 feet of water. But in terms of just the sheer raw damage, it's those mountainside flash floods that are I think are doing the most damage. And I think that's what a lot of people, there's not a magic wand to make them stop happening, but anything we can do to slow the floods down and not do as much jackhammer style erosion, that would, if you can change that even just a little bit, you'd be seen as miracle workers.
That's really good to know, like that kind of, the importance of looking at those tributaries in that way. Yeah.
I think what if we want to send David or Josh to basically put Stage Road the way it was before the flood?
I don't have it broken up by
road,
but
an educated guess, a couple $100,000.
few $100,000 for sure.
So if we spend $400,000 fixing a road,
Yeah.
how much would $400,000 get us in preventative measures? It's that kind of calculus we're looking at.
Yeah.
And Stage Road, so the Jones Mill Brook sort of runs along Stage Road, and then ends up down in the Jones Mill neighborhood, which is another area that was similar to this Snipe Island Brook area and Red Barn Lane and Lily Pond Circle, where they're sort of at the end of this, receiving all the water, and then many houses there were also inundated with water. So I think a solution for both what Jay's talking about up on the road, as well as like when it finally kind of gets to the end, anything we could do to help better protect those houses would be helpful.
Yeah.
It's very striking how in the last 10 years, we've had so many floods, but no two floods were even similar. We can have a flood where Bridge Street's underwater and there's extensive damage on the south side of town only. And then a couple of months later, we'll have extensive damage on the eastern side of town, and the western side of town is fine. It's just amazing how different each scenario is.
Yeah, and we're seeing just terribly destructive storm effects in places that historically, I mean, Red Barn Lane and Lily Pond had not historically had an issue with that kind of thing happening. I know we had a theory that it was raising. I know we have this theory that the recent repaving of Route 2 had raised the level of the road past there, Route 2, and basically creating an impromptu dam so the water couldn't flow over the road very well.
There was like multiple, like. Perfect.
Yeah. I live one street over, so this is.
Okay, yeah.
And I was high and dry because I'm on top of the hill, but these are my neighbors, and if you went over there, it just looked like a big broom had gone through.
And I guess in terms of like the model extents themselves, they'll be the extent, the footprint of the model will be such that it will capture that at a minimum, that 100-year floodplain. And so catching like things like looking at the road elevations and all of that will be incorporated kind of in the geometry of the model.
Just to better understand that specific scenario along Stage Road, was that stormwater runoff in a roadway ditch, or was that Jones Mill Road
That's a great question.
that caused that damage?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. We'd have to look at it closer, I think. I'm not exactly sure where the brook is and they probably overlap at some points, but I don't, without a closer look, I don't know.
I think there's also some differing opinion on what those words.
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
Marcy Harding again. I think I hear you talking about Stage Road. I have to say I'm really struggling to hear all of you, but I live on Stage Road, 2 miles up. The road was closed for 5 weeks officially. And I observed it numerous times, in the process of being reconstructed. And there was a lot of gravel that came down the road, washed out of the sides of the road. And a lot of culverts, a lot of people lost their culverts. I know a neighbor that spent $16,000 fixing their culvert. And I'm sure that they were just one. Pretty much everybody on the west side of the road lost their culverts. And I have heard, and I'm hoping maybe somebody up here on this side of the table can confirm this, that because of all of this erosion, that the lower part of the brook coming down along the side of Stage Road was filled with gravel, was filled. Is that true? Like maybe the lower quarter mile or half mile of it before it got to Route 2, maybe?
For the Jonesboro Brook, I understand that had been getting filled in for a number of years.
Okay.
I'm sure this storm added some more sediment to that. I don't know how much was there prior, but.
To Duncan's comment about the gravel. I mean, I don't remember which the contractor was who the contractor was that was working on Stage Road, but whoever they were, they brought load after load after load. You've got records of how many loads of gravel they put on there. And we get another storm and all that gravel goes down that river again and ultimately into the Winooski. And we're just complicating these problems a lot. And while I have the microphone, I just want to say I gather somebody said there was no limit on our ideas, but I gather we are limited to Richmond. But I just have to say that the area on 117, is it the River Road that goes to Essex, where Millbrook comes into the Winooski River, that's been eroding for years and years. I've written to V-Trans before about it. Like, you got to do something because this is just about to take out the road. And I think they finally did do some riprap in there, but it's just an accident waiting to happen. And it's crazy that it's so close to happening. Yeah, I had 3 things, but 2's been out.
Before we go to Susanna, there is a message in the chat.
Yeah, I'm gonna read that.
Okay.
So the question in the chat, my family lives on Lily Pond Circle and we have applied for a buyout. I understand that these projects are not coordinated, as in the work Stone is doing may not inform decisions regarding FEMA funding for a buyout. I'm curious if this project can help us with the difficult decision that will be coming regarding whether a buyout will happen and whether or not we should take advantage of it. It is a strange purgatory to fix your home, to move home because you have to, while also have
half expecting it to be
half
gone.
expecting it.
Yeah, do I fix it up? Or do I just, and feel stupid because it's gonna get washed out in the next flood?
So it sounds like two questions there. How will this impact buyouts and would it, should this work influence their decision on to do a buyout or not? Would this mitigate the need for a buyout?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. And
I think what we're going to do will provide information that can be helpful in perhaps in that decision making. We can't obviously help anyone make that decision explicitly. It's what we're going to show is where the water, where the model shows the water is going to be inundated and what the height of that water will be based on very high resolution data that we're gathering and the best possible input flow data that we can get. In terms of the FEMA buyout, the hazard mitigation program will consider buyouts within it if a project was included in that grant package that the town put together. But if there's other avenues for doing that as well.
yeah, I guess I would ask if they've already been working with the town through this. So there's the hazard mitigation grant program works in cycles. There's cycles of funding. There's and different amounts are awarded at different times. And I guess I would say if they've already started the process with the town, then I would continue consulting with you all on whether or not to move forward. And then, yeah.
Okay. Susanna on Zoom, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can barely hear you.
Okay, is that any better?
It is.
Okay, sorry, I'm sick, so I'm not gonna turn on my camera, but I just wanted to go back to Snipe Island Brook. I live on Lily Pond Circle, and different people from my neighborhood have already touched on different aspects of the Snipe Island Brook, but I think it would be really useful and interesting for Stone to kind of, I guess, view it as like there's so many layers to it. So there's like up top, there's the Beaver Dam, then further down Snipe Island Road, like the just whole structures just got like totally upended by the amount of water. And then down on Lily Pond Circle, like my neighbor Julie was talking about on Red Barn Lane, there's an inundation of water. And I know that's been happening for years. But then also behind Lily Pond Circle, kind of up on the hill, there's a huge amount of water that started coming down there. And then also the culvert that goes under Route 2 is not big enough. So there's just, I think, like so many different pieces to it. And I guess I want to communicate that it's like the whole system, which I'm sure you guys are already aware of, but I think it would be really interesting to try to track all those different pieces. And then I also wanted to ask the question about funding. Like, I'm confused about how does FEMA grant funding for, let's say, a project that would benefit a whole neighborhood versus a project that would be behind one person's house? How does that funding come in?
That's a really good question. And I don't know the nuances of like if there's a comparison between those two types of projects, but on a project by project basis as they're evaluated, it's really showing that cost effectiveness. So the benefits outweigh the cost, whether it's one home that's benefiting or it's multiple. So I think it kind of scales.
Yeah.
I'm really not familiar if there's like a direct kind of comparison in that way, though.
Yeah, my understanding is hazard mitigation, they evaluate the project
Yeah.
for the benefit cost analysis. So if that project's a house, like Megan said, or a whole neighborhood, that's what the project's considered. I do know FEMA also has a program called the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, which is different than the hazard mitigation program, which sometimes looks at kind of more broader and a little bit more creative solutions than some of the ones that hazard mitigation looks at. That's something I can point you to some information on if you want as well. But just to be clear, that's not what we're not looking at that program.
Yeah, and I guess something we can we can talk about too is like, we might see really great projects that maybe don't fit that hazard mitigation funding bucket, but we'll include them in the alternatives analysis. They'll be in the report. And so there'll be, you know, documentation that this was kind of vetted during this process, and maybe there's other funding opportunities down the road.
Hi, Stephanie, go ahead.
Thanks. This is about the timing of the property buyouts, kind of the flip side of what Kath was saying, although I agree with what she was saying. So now going the other image, this is about the floodway, Esplanade, the Volunteers Green area, Bridge Street, that whole area.
Right over there.
For individual, thinking about this, so the area of the park is supposed to flood. That's a floodway. So when it floods, I'm thinking about the timing of the buyouts, like the houses that we know we're going to keep flooding. I don't think that this project can fix that, but I'm wondering, we anticipate that several of the houses on Esplanade might be buyouts, and then there will no longer be structures to slow down the water that in these big floods comes. And I guess I'm trying to address the question of like, what are the vulnerable areas? So the way the last year's water and floods have gone, which have all been slightly different, but it's kind of pushing straight across the field and across Esplanade. And the more houses that are gone, I guess the more the waters, that current is going just straight across the street. And I guess I'm just saying to take that into consideration, that even though right now there are structures there may not be in a few years, and the water's moving that direction. And am I making any sense? Like, do you take into consideration?
I think your question is, with the buyouts happening and buildings being removed, how will that affect the flow of water through that area? Is that correct?
Yeah, or just, will you take that into consideration?
Yeah, will something be put into slow down?
Okay. And then I just wanted to add too, that I know that I read through the proposal and the questions, which is great. I really appreciate all you're doing. And that I know the water sewer treatment plant is like, solutions are being explored, which I think is great, but that the sewage that goes into the mix, because the water does recede quickly, like 15 feet of water comes up and then it recedes. But the stuff that's left isn't. So I'm also curious, like if the floodway might possibly get changed and how land might get redistributed from like Esplanade and other areas, so that whatever solution is come up with for the water sewer treatment plant, just things to take into consideration because of the way that current and the way the river is pushing towards Esplanade and towards the other side too. So just a lot to consider there.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful input and perspective on what's going on at that location. And for homes that will be like, that are going through the buyout process already, if there's information that we have on that, we will consider, in the modeling scenarios, okay, this has gone through the buyout process, this building will be demolished, and we'll include that in the assessment moving forward. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
We clearly have a very interested and willing to be involved citizenry here. Was there anybody, I'm intruding on the chairman's responsibility, but is there anybody here who has not spoken tonight who would like to? We have a couple of people who I've not seen get up and speak. Okay. Doug?
I had a quick question. I wanted to ask if there's any other, we've heard about Jones Mill Brook quite a lot in Snipe Island Brook. Is there other locations that we haven't discussed today that we should definitely be aware of when we're launching our modeling effort.
Dudley Road.
Go ahead.
Duncan's here, and again, I live in Huntington. And I understand that part of the scope is the Huntington River. And I also understand in communicating with the Huntington Town Administrator a week or two ago, Stone Environmental has already been in the town of Huntington starting research on the river. Is that so?
It's a slightly different project.
Different project.
Yeah, so that is a project that we are completing for the town of Huntington and CCRPC. And that is to develop water quality improvement projects. So they're all generally within the river corridor or within the corridor of the river's tributaries. But those are more along the lines of riparian buffer plantings, potentially strategically removing gravel bars within the river, reconnecting floodplains, expanding the river corridor to give it more space to spread out its energy, improving ditches. So that is, it's working towards the same common good, but a different approach. And
been working on that project.
not super long, probably since July, and it's a very small project. And it's not very far along. So that project took 15 sites identified in the 2009 River Corridor Plan that was produced by Dory Barton at Arrowwood and her colleagues. And it took 15 of those projects and it asked us as the selected consultant to help develop those projects to the next phase. And that next phase will be identifying how much phosphorus reduction comes with that project. And I guess finding ways to help advance it to conceptual design and finally implementation. But again, that study was done back in 2009. So a lot of those projects look quite a bit different now than they did back then 15 years ago.
We've had several meetings in Huntington because we've also suffered extensive damage the last couple of years.
I was actually in attendance at the one 2 weeks ago, I guess.
Okay, a select board meeting?
Oh, no, it was a special meeting on the Huntington River.
Yeah, that was something different. Yeah. And honestly, this is the first time I've heard that work is ongoing. Because some people in town who've been severely impacted, like a lot of folks we've heard from here tonight, have been pressing the Huntington Select Board to fast track a scoping study. And that is in the works, but it's not certainly progressing very rapidly. But I wanted to speak to something else, though. I didn't want to get sidetracked. I understand you will be studying the Huntington River as part of this particular scoping study project. And we are seeing tremendous amount of erosion. We have over a dozen people doing the buyout program. We're seeing the tributaries contributing to the issues. But the Huntington itself, it's different than the Winooski, of course, because of the steep terrains. And it's a narrow valley, and there are significant areas where the river is continuing to exaggerate meandering sinuosity, I'll say. And each flood event takes out more and more of the farm fields that are in Huntington. It's a very narrow band of good agricultural soils. And from Hanksville all the way down to Richmond, there are a handful of sites where there's been significant erosion damage. I happen to own a piece of property right in the lower village. And just in the last two storms, we've lost more than an acre of land into the river. And then the most frequent storm, we've had another couple of acres destroyed by being covered with rock and gravel. There's been a Burnt Rock Farm vegetable grower has been using that land for years. There's a portion of it that he will continue to use, but a significant portion has been destroyed. And our property and a handful of other properties up and down the river valley in the town of Huntington are losing these prime agricultural soils. And I said, we lost an acre. Well, that's 4 feet of Hadley agricultural soil. And 4 feet of soil for 1 acre, which we've lost, is over 60,000 cubic yards of topsoil that's gone into the Huntington River, made its way downstream, deposited a little bit here and there. Most of it reaches the Winooski. Some of it goes on to Chuck's farm fields, which is a good thing, I guess. But I'm guessing the greatest majority of it goes out to Lake Champlain. You just mentioned reducing phosphorus. Those soils naturally have phosphorus attached to them. And so when you have 60,000 cubic yards multiplied by a factor of, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 up and down the Huntington Valley, that's a tremendous amount of material that's going into the Winooski and into Lake Champlain and into people's homes on Esplanade. You know, the muck that had to be removed from those homes, a lot of that is topsoil that came from the farms in Huntington. And I hope that mitigation means that we will take a look at how we can reduce that severe erosion that is being caused by the buildup of gravel barns, quite frankly.
If I can add to what the gentleman said, I thought that the map of Dugway Road, you were asking if there are other places or particular points of concern. I would put Dugway Road at the top of that list. The Huntington River took a big bite out of Dugway Road. The road was gone. And we had to spend quite a bit of money. I don't remember what the total bill was, but it was a lot, several $100,000. How much?
Yes, there was another couple $100,000 project.
Right, just to put that back.
When this was built, it was built in the 30s, laid stone, and the river takes a sharp bend here, and the water rose so high that it overtopped everything that was built in the 30s to shield the road. And all of this was knocked out by the river.
So just downstream of the gorge.
It is the gorge, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we rebuilt that. I mean, it was probably 100+ year old stone wall. A lot of it got washed out.
Yeah.
So we worked with FEMA for a mitigation project and put in a new structure there, just concrete wall. And actually, Jay, if you pull that back up, if you go, while you're on Huntington Road, or sorry, Dugway Road and Huntington River, if you go a little south of there, so a lot of that was actually in the Halloween 2019 storm. And that's held up through all, I guess it's 3 floods now, 4 floods. So further south down there, I think the Aldrich Tree Farm, we lost some bank down in this area. Yeah, I think it's more down in this area, maybe, yeah. So in this, I could get you the exact locations, but sort of more in this area where Dugway kind of comes in to Huntington a little bit more, or towards the Huntington area. We had a significant bank erosion from the 23 storm, and then that eroded more in 24, and then other sites north of that also continued to erode. So I can get you exact locations on those from our road foreman and FEMA. But just another thing to consider.
Right. If you just on a rainy day drive, like the Dugway Road, you'll be able to look down and go, we could lose this, we could lose that, because the river is here, the road is here, and it's a dirt road.
Yeah.
And there's a steep slope above it, so all that water comes down, hits the road, goes over the road and into the river, and on a good rainy day, the whole road goes with it.
That's my commute.
Yeah.
I see it twice a day.
So you've probably seen the corners on the road before the water. Sorry.
What's that?
You've probably seen where the bank erosion is. So,
If it's passable, yeah.
yeah. Looks like there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. On the western end of town, a significant sandbar has developed. There's an island in the Winooski near the Checker House Bridge where Route 2 and the interstate cross. That sandbar keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's causing the river to widen. Conan's Field keeps losing as the river expands. On the eastern side, the bank's a lot more stable, but on the western side, it's a very sandy bank, which just keeps eroding and falling in.
This?
Yes.
Okay.
So the river is getting wider and wider, and that deposit of gravel is getting bigger and bigger. I've lived over there for over 20 years, and it's gotten probably 50% wider. So the question in the chat is, would it make sense to explore taking that gravel island out to open up the spillway to allow the water to flow?
Right, he's talking about this. And he's correct, it's getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, we could definitely, we'll look at that area. I think it's kind of too early to know exactly what they're.
The water does flow on both sides of it, so
Yeah,
if you closed off the right channel, at least the water would go to the left of it and perhaps dig a deeper channel. I don't know, but the main channel is to the left of it.
the other area that might be worth looking at is along Heinsberg Road by Phase Corners, also on the western end of town. That one really surprised us when it flooded. I live on Canyon Road.
Sorry, Dave. Jay, can you get your mouse away from that microphone?
Click.
It's all in here.
I was surprised with the flooding last July. The Phase Corners area washed out and flooded. Canyon Road, which floods out when we have dew in the morning, was fine. And then down at the bottom by Route 2, which always floods, didn't. So it was really strange that the higher elevation flooded. And Canyon Road is a dirt road that goes like this, that held, and then lower it didn't. The situation up on along Heinsberg Road was a beaver dam washed out and a culvert washed out, and it was just an exponential amount of water coming down through, and by the time it got to Phase Corners, it just blew everything out. So that might be an area to look at as well.
Yeah, and that's John working.
Yeah.
So I believe, I'm familiar with that for sure, and it's definitely an area of concern. I believe that is outside of the scope of this project, though.
Oh,
I believe, because I think I'd asked that
But,
at the initial meeting.
Yeah, I think that we were initially looking for focus on, Snipe Island, Huntington, and Jones Mill. Were sort of the three that we'd identified prior to the kickoff. And I know you guys, I mean, you have to limit it to some extent, right? You can't look at
Yeah.
everything.
'Cause I'd also asked about the drainage right along coming down Main Road too, because I know that did quite a bit of damage, especially at Besaw Road.
And I don't know where the second part that Stacy's asking about, which culvert.
That's through by the Reed property and across the.
By the school, oh, the one underneath Route 2, I
Yeah.
see, okay. Yeah, that also I think would be out of scope since it's a smaller side tributary.
Okay.
That we can't, I think we have to focus on certain areas, we can't do every single.
As much as we'd like to.
Well, as Stacy mentioned, I think it's changed at least 3 times, it was out of its bag, now it's back in its
Yeah,
bag.
ironically, the last flood actually corrected.
Put it back in, my understanding, yeah. So. Oh, we got it.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, and this is too.
I was actually curious, was that the Richmond road crew that re-armored the canyon ditch?
Yes.
Okay. They should went over that, the fact that that held through this summer was
I couldn't believe it.
miraculous. Yeah, they can do that in more places.
Yeah. They're getting good at that. Lisa.
Thanks. I'm thinking, budget deliverables at some point, 6 months down the road here, or wherever we're looking at. One is an obvious one, the current flooding conditions, I'm sure the Corps of Engineers, DEC, whoever has that pretty well documented. Second would be where your improvements are proposed, okay, related to current flooding. I think we'll see them lining up pretty well. The third overlay would be your projection of what those improvements are going to do, what the flood map, there will still be a flood map, but what that flood map would look like, what you think would look like. And that's a real commitment on your part because you're projecting the future. We can point to it and say they were right, point to it, and say they were wrong. But I think we need that to really guess, go beyond the guessing stage of, okay, we did this, we did that, it helped here, it didn't help here. We'll learn something from it. It won't be a complete success, or it won't be a failure either. So, and if we see success, I think we can start using your product, your deliverables, maybe for planning and zoning purposes and so forth. We can start actually moving past just the study part, doing something with all this.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And yeah, so I'm gonna get into a bit of the weeds of the modeling side here. But what we will do with setting up our the hydraulic model is during the development phase, we're going to do what we call validating it. So there's a lot of high watermark data from these floods we've had recently that we will use to validate our model to see if what we're simulating when we're simulating the July 2023 flood matches what you all actually experienced within like a reasonable range of uncertainty. There's always going to be uncertainty around these models. They're simulating potential conditions, so they're not, you know, they're not 100%, but yeah, so that's a key step in that process. And so that step gives us some confidence when we move to simulating the potential mitigation projects. Will change the topography or will change the culvert size in the model to match that proposed design that we'll work on in the conceptual design phase. Rerun the model simulations to kind of get an understanding of what we can expect after the project's implemented. Yep. So that, and incorporating that into the final deliverable, like along with visuals, showing the output, and narrative explaining, we'll include that in there.
If your model shows even some degree of accuracy in predicting events, you've got a job for life, I think. So
yeah.
Go ahead and you, Kath, go ahead.
Hi, it's actually Ernie Buford. Kath is here as well. I just wanted to, I hadn't heard anything about the village outside of Esplanade, and I just wanted to add that as an area to look at. You know, the map that's on the screen right now shows the bulk of Richmond Village not being in the floodplain, but there are a lot of flooding problems of various extents within the village, largely because of, you know, some factors that have been mentioned before, the steep terrain. There's a lot of water that drains down from the Valley View area and the cobble up there. All of that comes down steep drainages and goes under Brown's Trace Road in a small creek that basically goes into a culvert that's 1/3 of a mile long. You know, it's one thing to replace an undersized culvert, but when the infrastructure is 1/3 of a mile long, that's a non-trivial replacement. Is that because that goes under a lot of streets, it goes under the railroad track, goes under the lumber yard at the home supply. And my understanding is that infrastructure gets older and smaller diameter the further into it you go. So it basically fails in these large precipitation events that seem to be becoming more normal. And there are a lot of areas throughout the village that have moderate to severe flooding, and they're not even in the floodplain. People on Pleasant Street, people on Main Street. Yeah, so it would probably be good to look at drainage off of those areas up the hill there that contribute to flood waters in the village proper.
Remind me, you and Kath had purchased the Vermont Farm Bureau building and its basement completely filled with water, right?
Right, the basement of this building flooded in 23, in the July 23 flood. Basement completely filled up, took out the furnace and hot water and the water heater. And the same thing happened this July, soon after we had purchased the building.
That variant said it's not in the floodplain. It's just downhill from a lot of sloping property.
And that culvert that you were talking about is the issue that it's back watering. Water's backing up on like the upstream side of it.
There's too much water going into it, and you know, vegetation clogging the entrance is probably a factor there, but it's just, you know, the volume of water is more than that infrastructure can absorb. And so it basically makes Millet Street become a river. And we have the unfortunate circumstance of being at the low point on Main Street, which is right across from Millet Street. And just that river goes right down our driveway at the old, what's known as the old Farm Bureau building. But you know, as I said, there are a lot of people throughout the village. Christy Witters up on Baker Street above Tilden and Baker, I guess. She has a similar problem at her residence where a lot of floodwater coming down the hill, not associated with that culvert, but associated with a similar ravine that drains into her backyard, just washes out her driveway when these big precipitation events occur.
Bart, I think you're about to say what I was about to say, so I'll let you say it.
Well, I was going to observe, I'm a resident of Tilden Avenue, and so I contemplate this as another sort of secondary basin or tributary. If you think where that water comes from, you have to go way up the hill, at least a half a mile, if not a mile, to figure out where it started. And so it finds its way by gravity down the hill, and it scatters a little bit, but if you sort of walked up Jericho Road, or drove slowly up Jericho Road, you would see what's going on all the way up. And it feeds into a couple of places. What he was describing at Christy Witter's house, I think that infrastructure is something like 80 years old, Josh, in that neighborhood.
Least.
At
Not
least,
more.
yeah.
And so what you have is this historic village where things that made sense 80 or 100 years ago are increasingly overwhelmed. And I would observe that those areas are cut across by both an interstate highway, Route 89, and the state highway, Route 2, which contribute to the funneling in various locations. Essentially, instead of spreading it out, it exacerbated, funneling it into a narrower channel.
The interstate.
At least that's what it looks like.
Divert it through culverts, which channel it.
Yeah. That's
Susanna.
sore point with a lot of people.
I'm starting again. Since Ernie brought up the village, I just thought I would share with you all something that I really wish I had printed that size so I could hold it up. I can't, but I'm happy. This is a picture that I saw in a little pamphlet that was sent to me by VPIRG. And there was no caption on it, but of course I recognized it as our village. And I did find out from VPIRG what the origin of the picture was. And it was taken by the Vermont Air Guard in July 2023, not this year, but a year and a half ago, which surprised me. And I was really interested in this picture because of the work that's being done right now to consider moving the playground up to the knoll. And if you zoom in on that picture, you can see that the water is almost up to the floor of the band shell. So I just want everybody to keep that in mind. I think that picture should be on the wall in the town center somewhere because it is the part of the story of our village. And the other point I wanted to make about your work is you've talked a lot about modeling and we've talked about Stage Road. And I'm curious to know if your modeling will take into changes in the land in recent years, particularly the last year or 2 or 3 years. There's been 2 pretty significant logging operations that have happened fairly high up, which drains down the road to the lower part of the road, which is where it washed out. There's a really big driveway going in. Actually, there was already a driveway, but apparently it didn't meet the town regulations. It was too steep, so they're putting in a different driveway, which has involved a lot of clearing. And there was another driveway just above our house that was put in that also involved a lot of clearing. And I'm just wondering if your model takes into consideration changes like that, because they're pretty significant.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we'll specifically be developing a hydraulic model that's looking at the river itself. So it's a little bit different from a like watershed scale model that might be looking at rainfall and runoff. But with our model, we do use multiple sources of data for like the topography and bathymetry we're using. And then We also set a parameter that's called a roughness parameter for like the overbank floodplain areas as well as the channel. And we look at the most recent aerial imagery we can for when we're setting that parameter. And if that area is in that extent of the model in that overbank area, we would use a parameter that would reflect like a more bare ground scenario versus a fully forested. For setting up the model geometry, so for creating that land surface, that topography, we're going to be using state available LiDAR data, which I'm going to be forgetting the year, the Q. Vermont, either in 2023 or 2022, I think it's 2023, collected a new statewide LiDAR data set. So we're going to be using that coupled with the data that Whiteout Solutions is collecting for the river itself and bank areas for the topography. So that's pretty recent data that we'll be using and for the terrain itself. So that coupled with the aerial imagery, we strive to model the current situation as much as possible.
I'm going to read a statement from the chat and then I'm going to call on Sam. So Savannah says, I also wanted to note that I'm interested in some potentially less expensive flood mitigation work that would involve planting native trees and shrubs to provide more canopy cover and stabilize stream banks. Is this something Stone could advise on?
That is definitely something that can be considered along with other more active restoration or active mitigation types of projects. Sometimes that's something that goes along with a stabilization or reconnection or even in the culvert picture we had some plantings at that upsized bridge and culvert. So yeah.
Sam Pratt, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I have, I guess, a comment and a question. The comment would be, I wonder if perhaps it would make sense to consider integrating some, I don't know, guidelines for, clear cutting into the town plan or something, because some of these things can't really be accounted for until the land is cleared, right? So if it's not cleared responsibly, you can't really account for that, beforehand. So I guess that's just my comment. And I've read through some of the town plan and do have some, I guess, issues with the town maybe not adhering to the best practices for how we do land development. And there are resources like, CCRPC that have good guidelines that maybe we could follow better. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's separate from this project, but I feel like I would just offer that as something that we might want to consider, especially with the town plan renewing. My question is kind of building off of a couple questions ago, talking about sort of, I guess, both Donahue Brook, but also some of the flooding in the town itself that's not in the floodplain. I live in the Valley View Road neighborhood just off of Jericho Road. And even at our slightly higher elevation, my house is at, I don't know, 600 feet above sea level or something. And we in both floods ended up with damage to the road. So it is occurring pretty high up. My question is about scope of some of these projects and whether or not there's a limit to, if it's got to be like a bigger project, like we're going to do a big culvert replacement, or if one project could be considered, we want to try to slow down water in, on 50 properties, like uphill, right? So that if that could slow the water down, then maybe that would result in, a smaller amount of water coming through some of those culverts where there are issues. So I'm just curious what that process looks like. And I guess also how do you rank that? Like, how do you choose, what is going to get submitted, for review for the funding?
Yeah. That's a good question. So in terms of when we get to that project after the projects have all been identified, when we get to the vetting stage, that's when we'll be in that alternatives analysis phase. And so we'll be taking into consideration the overall potential benefit of the project. And, you know, a small project could have a potential benefit for multiple property owners. So that will play into the consideration in the alternatives analysis. Some of the other things we'll consider there are just eligibility for the hazard mitigation funding program, feasibility, how constructible is the project, the permitting, ease or constraints, alignment with overall community interests, and is this something that, you know, folks have really expressed concern around this area, and cost effectiveness of the project. So we will put all of the projects identified through that alternatives analysis process, and then come back to the town and work with you all on kind of narrowing down which ones to select to move forward for the conceptual design phase. So we'll come up with the recommendations, but then work with you all to figure out the one that actually gets progressed further to the application phase.
I think it's good to note that one of the deliverables, even if we don't necessarily bring all of the projects to a hazard mitigation grant, is we will have identified many projects that could be beneficial. So that could be followed up on after the fact.
Yeah, that'll be first some funding.
Yeah.
Unavailable. We'll already have some.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that, I guess I would say that maybe this was something that the RCC or the select board might want to consider. If there is a cost benefit analysis that a certain amount of money is going to save the town much more money, if it doesn't necessarily meet the requirements for the FEMA funding, maybe that's something that the town would want to consider using conservation reserve funds for, just because it seems like that would just be a, you know, money well spent. So I'm very interested to see the whole list once you've done your analysis, regardless of what actually qualifies.
Any questions from anyone else?
When's the next meeting like this? Kind of a planning session rather than a wrap-up session? How much time do you think you need to digest this and get a work product going?
Yeah.
You can present before, you know, you actually
To
finish
the
it.
kind of the timeline we had
Mhm.
put together. So right now we're in December. And we're hoping to start on the hydraulic study portion. And I think, you know, if we're able to stay on track with this timeline, we're able to get out in the field and get the LiDAR data collection, which is that weather dependent kind of element. We were looking at the end of February for the alternatives analysis, maybe into March. And the reason I have the hydraulic modeling continuing to go is to get to that. We'll be continually refining it as we're selecting the project to move forward in the design phase. So we'll, you know, continue using the model through the rest of the project.
I'd kind of assume you're going to steal a little bit of time from the early parts of that schedule and put them in the later parts of the schedule.
I think so, yeah. 'Cause you did
Right now, just show them equal, but yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to change.
Yep, and we'll stay in communication as you know,
Mhm.
things progress and any hiccups that arise.
Well, we look forward to working with you because you can plainly see this is a matter of urgency for virtually everybody in town.
And it's getting worse.
All of us are going, we had a big storm in December 2 years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
we never know if we're going to wake up in the middle of the night and hear.
Mhm.
Well, thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. All those in favor of adjournment?
Aye.
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 Well,